Trauma is the psychological, emotional, and physiological response to an event or an experience that overwhelms our ability to cope. It can affect how we think, how we feel, and how we behave, and of course, how we relate to others, sometimes for years, decades after the event. Welcome to episode 4 of A Happier Me, the podcast with myself, Steve Phillip, founder of the Jordan Legacy CIC, and my good friend, Dr. Manoj Krishna, founder of the app HappierMe, which helps adults and young people lead happier and more fulfilled lives. This week, we're discussing the impact of past trauma in our lives. And Manoj, I'd like to start by asking you, how common is trauma?
Well, Steve, the stats suggest about 70% of people have had past history of past trauma. But when I talk to individuals, they say, no, the number is probably 100% because everyone's been touched in some way by some past trauma. 15% of teens, for example, develop PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder as a result. And of course, a person who suffered before experiences more trauma, or more events feel like trauma as a result. There's a high correlation, as you know, between trauma and suicidal thoughts, and events can feel overwhelming. So if you've suffered past trauma, losing a job can suddenly feel overwhelming and like, oh, there's no way out. There's
It's really
11
interesting.
times, yes, 11 times higher risk of suicide attempts with history of past trauma, and 4 times greater risk of depression.
Yeah, sorry, I was leaping in there because I was going to say, absolutely the correlation is there. We know that childhood trauma particularly has a huge influence on um, really mental health issues as people grow up, and suicidal ideation. We know it plays a large factor there. And traumas, as you say, come in many different forms. It could be a breakup of a relationship. It could be the loss of a job. I think we sometimes maybe just think of trauma as being some major catastrophic event we've experienced or witnessed, the sort of event that might be on the news. But trauma, I suppose, is all relative, isn't it, to the individual?
Yes, it's very relative. And what you and I may regard as life, someone else might regard as trauma, or the other way around. I mean, just
Absolutely.
one stat that struck me the other day, physical and sexual violence against women. 30% of women will experience some form of physical or sexual abuse in their lifetime, and 20% of relationships are abusive. 1 million cases of violence against women and girls were registered by the police in 2023 in Britain.
I mean,
So,
that's a colossal number. I
astonishing
mean,
number, right?
really interesting. Something came to mind, and I know before we came on air today, it was one of the things I noticed you included in your list. But it was going through my head that even childbirth.
Yes.
We talk of it being traumatic for the mother quite often. It's a joyous experience in many ways, but I would certainly not necessarily want to come back as a female and go through that experience. I don't think, but
Oh,
but the child itself is going through quite a
oh
traumatic
my
experience.
goodness. Yes. Childhood trauma is behind, I don't know. I don't know the exact number, but a significant amount of mental health problems that adults face are linked in some way to trauma they've experienced in childhood. And trauma could be neglect. It doesn't have to be shouting and beating. It could be
Yeah, that's really
criticism.
important.
It could be criticism, just repeated criticism, or it could come from schools where a teacher's random remark might be, "Oh, you're no good at this," or "You'll never be any good," and that could be for a child hugely traumatic. Of course, there's money, crime, illness, bereavement. There's no shortage of tough things that happen in life, right?
Yeah. So it's very much about how, what constitutes trauma to us, and we'll talk a little bit about how we deal with that, but also in a moment how we impact that. I'm really familiar with a statistic that I use quite often when I'm delivering talks around suicide prevention, and quite often when I'm delivering talks to the police. And I remember hearing this at a family liaison conference that I attended with Durham Constabulary about a couple of years ago, and it was a statistic shared by the charity PTSD 999 that provides support for the frontline services. And that statistic said that on average, most civilian people through their lifetime may experience 3 to 4 traumatic events of one kind or another, which is interesting. But then when we heard about a frontline police officer, may in a 30-year career experience 400 to 600
Wow.
traumatic events. I mean, that is just a colossal number. When you think about the multiple call outs they may have in a single day, from maybe a suicide attempt to a road traffic accident to whatever it would be, really high pressure job. And there'll be many other similar jobs out there
Oh, I'm
where
sure. Armed
trauma is so
forces,
much higher.
ambulance, so many jobs, right, where you're faced with trauma.
Yeah.
So,
Absolutely. And that was interesting, just that correlation between, say, armed forces and the police. And I heard someone say not that long ago that in some respects, the armed forces, they'll experience the trauma when they're called into action or posted abroad, wherever. And then they have this period of time where they can come back and kind of decompress. And that's not to minimize the trauma they experience. But I think the thing with the police we're saying, it's kind of a constant
yes,
every day in their career. And of course, that's got to have a cumulative effect. So I suppose one of the questions I wanted to ask you was, how does trauma impact us?
yes. You see, trauma impacts us in many, many ways that we may not be familiar with or aware of. So, for example, it impacts our mental health. We become quick to anger. We're much more easily triggered, but we don't see that. We blame our relationship for the fact that that person is responsible for triggering us, not realizing actually it's some past trauma that's heightened our nervous system and it's very fragile. Or trauma makes us feel like a victim. It's poor me, somebody left me or somebody died or I was robbed or whatever it might be. It's not you personally. That's the main thing to realize. It's what your mind is doing to you. So your mind is making you feel like a victim.
And I'd like to just pick up on this for a moment because I think this is really relevant. And, I'm going to be very cautious of not identifying anyone here at all. But just recently, I've been having an exchange with somebody, via LinkedIn who has had an experience where essentially he's been not able to see his 2 young daughters for many years and has had real challenges with his ex-partner, real challenges with the council and the authorities. The anger he's feeling is immense, and that's shooting off in all kinds of directions at the moment. And despite my best efforts to try and coach him through this in a way and talk about how he might reflect on this and reframe some of what's going on and to strengthen his own position instead of just being angry at everybody. It's been almost impossible to do that. He's got to such an extent where he is the victim and may well be, and the evidence suggests he is, of unreasonable behavior that trauma has now affected him to such a level that he's just fighting out at everybody at the moment.
Yes. You see, when you point this out to people, they can feel judged. They can feel, oh, you're telling me I'm not a victim. No, no. What we're saying is your mind is making you feel like a victim, and that's paralyzing you from doing something to come out of this. So you can be trapped in this feeling of victimhood, and it really paralyzes you from doing something about it. So you spend all your life being miserable, and actually, that's not serving you. Right? Life is so short. So just by realizing, that's what my mind is doing to me, and that's not serving me, and that's stopping me from being happy right now. The trauma was in the
And
past, you see?
this was the kind of point I was trying to get across, but he was so entrenched in this position. Now he believed he didn't have a choice to reframe it in any other way, or considering how this was impacting on him. You've talked about the mind, clearly how the mind is controlled by this feeling of being a victim. But of course, assuming there'll be kind of physical manifestation. Well, I say I'm not assuming. I'll share my own story in a moment, but I'm assuming there'll be physical
Of
issues that
course.
develop as a result of this.
Yes, yes. I mean, you have sleep problems, you have somatic problems. That means you have pain all over the body. You can feel tired all the time. You're very anxious, you're vulnerable, you don't feel safe. Um, you find it difficult to love others because you're so consumed by your own suffering. And because you can't love others, you can't be nourished by other relationships because all relationships need that love to sustain them. So, because this trauma is what it's doing to you, and the other thing that happens is it becomes part of our identity. So it's no longer just Manoj, it's Manoj and all the trauma he suffered. You see? So I wear it like a coat that I don't want to take off. And I don't realize, I hang on to it so tight, but I don't realize it's not serving me.
I suppose others will see you wearing that coat on occasions.
Yes, yes, that's how they see me.
Yeah.
Don't just see me, they see me with that coat, which is all my suffering and trauma and everything
Mm.
comes from there. So it's very interesting, and I'm curious about this. I've, as a kid, fallen, cut myself. We all have, bruised. I can see the scars and I can touch them and they don't hurt,
Mm.
right? But I can remember what happened, but that it's no longer painful, the scar. Do you know what I mean? But something about the way our emotional pain is sustained by our mind and continues to make us suffer years and years after the initial event. And it's just curious why we don't recover from that. Or not all of us, but some of us don't recover, right?
No, and I am curious about that because I'll share my own experience, and for everyone listening, that will be very familiar, I'm sure. For some new listeners, maybe not, but the fact that losing my son Jordan to suicide, which is now 5.5 years ago, although I was never formally diagnosed, I'm very confident reflecting on the symptoms that I was experiencing PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, as a result of that. And that would manifest itself in two very clear ways. One was I could be just sitting on the sofa watching television and my head would violently flick to one side, probably as I was reliving
Hmm.
or processing what had happened so recently. And the other thing, I could be just standing at the kitchen sink washing up, and it was as if someone had punched me in the stomach
Hmm.
and knocked me backwards. Literally, I would be physically knocked backwards, and that would then lead to panic attacks. It's hard to recall this now, but there were many occasions where my wife would be physically holding me down in the bed due to the violent shakings. Now, as with others I've spoken to, we're five years on, and that trauma did subside. But to this day, that head twitch
Hmm.
under moments of stress comes back, and it's almost as like you said, it's that scar, almost like touching that scar. It's still there. It's nowhere near as intense as it was. Um, but if I'm under any duress or stress, then that just sudden flick of the head will happen, and that's just really interesting to know that those scars, although I'm not aware of them every day, are still underlying
Yes.
and still there.
And one area to also highlight, Steve, is that because of this suffering, which we can't seem to find an escape from, we turn to alcohol or drugs or some other escape which doesn't serve us. So, substance abuse in people who've suffered trauma is much higher. And of course, the combination of trauma and substance abuse often correlates very highly with crime, prison populations around the world, and so on. So it's a vicious cycle, and you can go on a
Mm.
downward spiral from a single traumatic event in the past, you know?
That's really interesting. And kind of what, I mean, again, just keeping curious about this for a moment, what kind of underlying patterns are at work there, as far as
Yeah,
trauma is
so
concerned?
it's worth understanding just asking a question, right? What's going on in my mind to make something that happened 20 years ago or 10 years ago still cause pain, whereas my physical scars, the body heals itself. What's going on?
Mm, mm.
And one of them is conditioning. It's this process by which our past influences shape our thoughts and our feelings and behavior, and then we become attached to that conditioning. We could become attached to that identity, if you like. So it's almost like a thief comes into your house at night and puts his or her thoughts in your head. And you wake up and you think, oh, that's me. And you want to defend them. But except that's just the past trauma. So just realizing that this is what your mind is doing to you, it's how it's processing things, but in a way that doesn't serve you, that can be the beginning of freedom. The other thing that happens is fear, because we don't want, our mind doesn't want to repeat that, whatever's happened. So we become hyper vigilant. We don't trust people. We become anxious, guarded in relationships. Our heart remains closed, quick to get angry, quick to get triggered, and easily hurt. So we misinterpret things that people are saying or doing, and and the pain we feel, the reaction is real, but it may not be true. It may not
That's
reflect what's actually happening outside, you know?
really interesting. I mean, I don't know about anyone who listened today, but you shared a couple of interesting images and analogies. One, the wearing of the coat,
Yes.
and the thief coming in through the bedroom window. Really strong visuals. And I think if people, for me, it takes it from being something that's inside me to actually something external that I could
Yes.
maybe deal with. I can maybe lock the window,
Yeah.
and or
And you could
take the
take the
coat
coat
off.
off. Yes, yes.
Yeah, which is really interesting. And I suppose that leads me then to another question, which is what can we do to minimize the impact of trauma on our lives?
Yes, I think the first thing to realize is it's not you, it's what your mind is doing or has done to you. So you can separate yourself from that, observe it, and realize that you have the power in you to deal with that using your intelligence, your agent. You have agency. You can be in charge of your own healing. See, that's the first thing. And I think it begins with compassion. Be compassionate to yourself for what's happened, for your own suffering. Don't blame yourself, for example, and be compassionate to others. Now, that story you mentioned of the two brothers and their parents and no love and so on.
Yeah, this was something we were talking about before we came on air, of course.
Yes,
So,
yes, yes.
yeah, yeah.
So, I mean, this is a very common story that there are many people who've not had the love in their lives that they would have liked as children. Now, you could look at that and blame your parents, for example, or you could look on them with compassion and say maybe they were suffering too and didn't have that capacity to love others, just as your suffering reduces your capacity to love others, you see?
And
Once you
this was
see,
something that did come across on the TV program where they kind of, the two brothers that we were talking about, just for context for anyone listening, on a TV show, Race Across the World, these two brothers who are now in their 60s talking about the lack of love from their mother. But one of them did say that, well, her mother was very much the same. So it was kind of taking the blame away from their mother and saying, well, this was maybe the way she was brought up as
yeah,
well. So again, they were taking a compassionate approach
yes.
to
So I
their
think
mother.
finding that sense of compassion in ourselves is probably the first step to healing and realizing that you have the agency to heal yourself. By the way, none of the things we're going to be talking about are simple or easy, right? But it's completely possible. And I have seen, I'm sure you have seen many people who've recovered from their past trauma. I think the second thing is to realize it's the automatic way our mind has been conditioned by our past and reacts from that conditioning to what's happening in the world around us. So something may have happened 20 years ago, but it's shaping our life even now.
Mm.
And just seeing that invisible link between the past and present and how this has become part of our identity and it's not serving us. Seeing that clearly, Steve, sometimes can just shift your mindset.
How do you do this practically though? Because yeah, I absolutely hear what you're saying, and I think it's right about being more compassionate with ourselves. It's about drawing that line between what's happened in the past and now. And there may be some people listening that are thinking, I get it, but what can I do physically? Is this about writing journals at the end of days?
Yes,
What
so there are
what
many
sort of things?
practical things we could do. I think journaling is a good first step. It's just writing everything down that you're feeling, thinking,
Mm,
what's happened, etc. So I'd say there's a 3 or 4 step process. The first is to perhaps become aware without resistance or shame or guilt about what's happened to you and
mm,
how this is shaping your life in ways that you may not be aware of, right? Because you may think your partner is responsible for how you're feeling, but it may not be that. It may be the past. Or you may not realize, or you might just become aware that, oh my God, I'm so easily triggered. And that's not the external environment right now, it's the past.
mm,
Or you might realize, actually, right now I feel I'm quite safe. My environment around me is safe, though my mind is telling me, oh, it isn't, but it's not telling me the truth. I think the second step is to take ownership. This is really hard. Ownership doesn't mean you're to blame or someone isn't to blame. Ownership just means I'm going to do something about it myself. Because unless you take ownership, as long as you're blaming the world, and because the world's not going to change, you
mm.
can't change. Taking ownership just means I'm going to do something. And then just be curious. Ask a question. How has this shaped my life? How can I be free? Why do I carry this memory? I've got one more tip. As you say, when you're at the kitchen sink, suddenly you're hit by a punch in the tummy, memory of Jordan, right? There is a way of being with a feeling that's challenging without running away from it or escaping from it. And just use your breath. Going to show people around the HappierMe app. There's plenty of breathing exercises. But if you can breathe into this feeling and stay with it, it passes. No feeling lasts forever,
Mm.
right? Whether it's a feeling of falling in love or stress or this past trauma or pain, everything passes. You just have to be with it long enough and then it passes. And each time it comes up, if you can meet it without thinking, just by being with the sensation of it, right? The next time it's weaker and then it's weaker still and so on.
That's a really interesting point because I think whenever we experience, and I think back to my own traumatic experience, you immediately think, what's wrong with me, what's going on? You want to fight against it, but what I'm hearing you say is it's about kind of riding it out and accepting it, and if you do that, then that minimizes the emotional impact
Impact.
that's
And it
going to have on
minimizes
you.
the residual scarring that it leaves behind.
Ah,
See,
okay.
because the the past is kept alive by our thinking. This happened to me, that happened to me, poor me, all of that. And by meeting something without thinking, just by staying with the sensation of it, using our breath, not easy, by the way, but it's a skill everyone can learn, like swimming, then your mind processes that in a different way. And then that's the beginning of your journey to healing. See, because that moment will pass. Give yourself
Mm.
a couple of minutes, it'll pass, and you can carry on washing the dishes or whatever it is you're doing.
We hear and often have often heard about living in the present, living in the now. I remember a good many years ago reading the book by Eckhart Tolle, the Power of Now. I think
Yes.
it was the title of the book, and listening to one of his conferences, and it became a very big thing. But right now, as you say, we may well be safe in our environment.
Yes.
So how do we kind of live in the now rather than keep drawing on past trauma, do you think?
Self-awareness, Steve, is the key. And also just become curious about the environment you're living in. Like, yeah, look at things in your life that you take for granted. And you just pay attention, be with the food you're eating, the glass of water and the sensation of it going down your throat. Or when you're meeting people, be completely present there. Doesn't mean that the past is suddenly going to switch off or disappear,
Mm.
but the impact of it on your life will become less and less, and you'll gradually, move on. I think there's also great importance of forgiveness because if we hold on to grudges, and of course, if you're a human on this planet, people are going to behave badly. People are going to, do things that everyone would regard as mean or whatever. So it's so important to forgive because yourself as well as others, because people are only human and they act from ignorance rather than from malice most of the time. Everyone acts from their self-interest, for example, or from their suffering. That example of the two brothers and their mother, it's a very common example. When you're suffering, you don't have the capacity for love. And so just to
And
forgive,
even self-love, of course. Yeah.
yes, yes, yes. And
Yeah.
just to
Yeah.
forgive people and so on. So there's so much you can learn about your own reactions and how they come from your past and ask yourself, does this serve me? And quite often it doesn't, you see.
No, and it's really interesting this thought around self-forgiveness. Very often when I deliver talks, and I'll reference the fact that I didn't see the signs that might have given us an indication that Jordan might have been at risk of suicide. And I often talk about the fact with the education I have now, those signs in hindsight are very, very clear. And when I share that publicly, quite often people will respond by saying, "Oh, you mustn't blame yourself." And I've become very clear on my response to that now that this is no longer about blame. It might have been initially, and this is not about self-criticism. And maybe this is me forgiving myself in a way, but it's recognizing that at the time I just wasn't equipped with the knowledge and the skills and the resources that would have allowed me to spot those signs,
Yes.
which is why I now go out and do the work that
Yes.
I
So
do
you've
in terms of
channeled
educating
all
people.
that into something amazing, which is to help others and educate others. And I think you read right, Steve. You just forgave yourself. Right.
I think so. Yeah, I never thought of it in that way until we've had this discussion today. But I think it is really important to recognize that. Now, you've shared some few ideas in terms of how people can maybe live in the now and how they can maybe deal with some of this past trauma. But of course, one of the features of our podcast each time we speak is to just to dip in briefly to look at the app that you developed, the HappierMe app. And this week, we're going to take a look at an area where you can help those who download the app to put into practice some of the things that we've talked about today. So I'm going to let you set up the screen sharing. For anyone watching this on YouTube, you'll get to see this. For anyone just listening to the audio version of the podcast, we'll try and be as descriptive as we can here, or Manoj will be as we go through the
Yes.
description. But we'll just let that transition happen.
Okay. Right. Just give me 1 second, Steve, while I log
We
in.
can edit this bit out anyway, can't
Yeah,
we?
yeah, yeah.
So
Just give
yeah,
me
yeah,
a
yeah.
quick second to log in. How's that so far? I think it's going really well.
It's good. No, I'm really liking. Yeah, I I'm enjoying this conversation. I think it's
I
been.
mean,
I
it can
just
never be exhaustive, but I guess it gives people enough food for thought. Okay.
yeah,
I'm just going to
definitely.
get started. All right. So, Steve, thank you so much for our conversation so far. And what I want to do is take a minute to just showcase some of the resources we've developed inside the Happier Me app for both adults and teens that can help people who are suffering from past trauma overcome it more easily. So, I'm just going to share my screen and show you around. So, this is the Happier Me app for adults. And in the menu on the top right, you can find the one for teenagers. So it starts off, and I'm just going to show people the relevant bits of the app. There's much more here, of course. So the Feel Better Now section helps you deal with whatever it is you're feeling now, a powerful emotion. There's a beautiful blog here called Difficult Emotions, A Guide to Freedom, and it talks about a stepwise approach to deal with the problem. If you're stressed, for example, and overwhelmed, you can do a breathing exercise and a meditation to feel better now. And then the app helps you go deeper to understand the nature of stress and how you can meet this stress with your own wisdom and your own agency. Or, for example, at the bottom, there's a module on conditioning, which again helps you understand how past trauma shapes your life. There's a conversation on the subject, and of course, lots of stories where conditioning impacted the people in those stories and how they managed to get out of it. So that's one great section for people who are suffering.
And I think that's just to interrupt briefly there for a moment, Manoj. What's important here. There are many apps out there that will give instant solutions to dealing with trauma, on the face of it, at least. That's what they profess to offer. But this, from what you've shown me here, again, is about taking people on a bit of a journey to understand why trauma occurs and just to get a better understanding of trauma before looking at techniques that will help them minimize that trauma.
Yeah, and I think the understanding is what brings freedom. Understanding your own hidden mind is what brings real freedom because that allows you to shift your mindset. Otherwise, the automatic way your mind functions in the background is running your life. And your past trauma is running your life. You think you're in charge of your life, but you're not. And this deeper understanding of ourselves helps us take charge of our own happiness. And we show people, or we give people the tools on how to do that. So there are 8 broad subjects. So whether it's relationships, mental health, that people can access, that's the other piece. There are lots of podcasts, for example. And if you look at mental health, we have dozens of podcasts on how you can overcome past trauma and deal with challenges in your life. Similarly, there are videos, blogs, there's a wellness survey. You can also reach out to a coach and so on. This is a mental health gym, probably my favorite part of the app. So, as we go, we brush our teeth so they remain healthy in the long term, or we go to the gym to look after our physical health. Even if you're suffering from trauma, you come here to the mental health gym, and this is a place where you can just go on a journey of learning about your own mind without trying to solve any problem. And it's that learning, deeper learning about yourself, that can bring lasting freedom. On the Explore page, there are coaches you can contact, but there's this program called Pathway. It's a personal growth program, and it takes people on a journey of healing. So it starts off with developing a calm mind. They're breathing exercises, meditations, audio meditations, and tapping exercises. Then you learn about your own mind. So what is inquiry? What is awareness? How to ask questions. And then you learn how your mind works. So, for example, we're all conditioned. We've talked about conditioning a lot, and there's a whole module on that. From there, you can learn how to manage your emotions, whether it's depression, because we didn't talk about it much, but depression is much commoner in people with trauma. Mm-hmm. And lastly, how to apply that then to have healthier relationships, deal with stress, for example, deal with overcome any negative habits or addictions that might have developed, and so on. So the app is rich in resources, not just for adults, but here, the first section, there's a complete separate app for teenagers to help children deal with their trauma. And as you know, increasing numbers of young people are facing trauma and reacting in the same way to that. So I hope
Absolutely.
These resources will help many of the people listening to find their own solutions to these problems.
Yeah, and I think in a world where too often people are looking for a quick fix, I think what's really important about HappierMe is that it digs deeper, and sometimes it's not about dealing with the surface issues. It is about looking at the deeper rooted causes, and that's one of the things that I know HappierMe does really well. Manoj, yeah, I'm sure this has been a really useful conversation for everybody listening. And if you are tuning in via the YouTube video or via the Podbean audio version only, if you'd like to leave some comments below or leave comments on social media as well, that would be great. And if you'd like details about how to access the Happier Me app. We're going to include the information on our social media platforms when we share this podcast. It will also be on the jordanlegacy.com website under the headline menu of radio show and podcasts, where if you sign up to the app actually through the Jordan Legacy, there is a discount code there. So you can actually get the app for a special price there via the Jordan Legacy website. But Manoj, thank you. As always, enjoyed our conversation today. And thank you everyone for tuning in and listening. And we'll be back next month with a brand new topic, which we'll be announcing very soon. But take care and have a safe, healthy and hopeful rest of your week.